Good morning. Happy Thanksgiving. It has arrived, believe it or not. We have been going through a series in which we have been looking at what it means to be thankful, called I Give Thanks. And it's kind of helpful that we do it as a series so that we don't have to do it all at once. And so we can get into it kind of in more details. And so we're in part 3 today of I Give Thanks. And today we're going to talk about specifically what it means to get together and worship God. Because part of what Thanksgiving is about, and as Christians, we believe it's worship of God. You know, that we worship God and we seek Him. And so I want to talk a little bit about that today. And Psalms 100 will be my main text. But I want to start off by talking about what is it that makes, a lot of y'all are cooks and you're getting ready to cook something for Thanksgiving. And you have to have great ingredients. Okay, if you want to really have good food, it needs to be fresh. It needs to be, from the source. And so I want to say a few words about some of the great ingredients in worship. And one of them is humility. Okay, and so what do I mean by that? Well, I'll give you an example. There's this person, Paul, in the New Testament that talks a lot about what he gave up to become a follower of Christ. And he threw away some things which were pretty valuable in his day. And I got to thinking about the things that we get rid of. A few weeks ago, I took a couple of trips to the dump to get rid of some of the stuff that is in our garage. Before I got married, when I was single, we had like this plan. I had this plan. You use what you got until it breaks. And then when it's used up and it's no value, you throw it away. And then I got married, and we've been married a long time, and we got a new plan. You use what you got till it's broken and useless to you or anybody else, and then you put it in the garage. Because you never know. And this is like it is. I'm just telling you like it is. We keep all this stuff that, and so I take to the dump, boxes that the bottoms have come out of, paint cans that have rusted completely shut, with the paint doesn't even shake when you shake them. I got all kinds of things in the, fertilizer stuff that's old, and so we got all this stuff and we finally throw it away. And you don't throw it away, I think, because you're afraid you're going to throw something valuable. You don't want to throw something away and then go, hey, what happened to my... because it's not just your stuff, it's your partner's stuff and your family's stuff. And so some things have sentimental value. We still have I'm not going to get into this, but we have got some valued treasures that we have inherited from our parents that are still in the garage. And we're going to do something with them, I promise, one day. I'm not going to promise. But you're afraid to throw things away. Now, then there are people who have nice things that they throw away because they have to. For instance, suppose you had, I guess if you're a guy and you were wearing something nice, let's say it's a Brooks Brothers suit. I don't know what clothes, women, Versace, I don't know. Something nice, okay? And somebody jumps in the pool and is not able to make it out, you jump in with your clothes. You don't care because that's more valuable. So you're not worried about it then. Okay, and so, if you think in the history of our country, way back in the pioneer days, I've heard stories of when they were traveling out west, and it was in the maybe fall and early winter, and they were in a Conestoga wagons, and they get to going in the mountains, and the wagons are heavy, and the wheels are straining, and there's snow on the ground, and the horses are pulling, and finally they can't go any further. They go as high as they can, and the wagon train leader says, okay, we've got to unburden the wagons. And so the children are crying, the parents are crying, and over the rocks, into the ravine, furniture, chests, precious things, a piano, things you not normally throw away, but you got to make it. And the Bible has stories about that. The Bible has stories where, a ship is going down and they have to lighten the ship and they throw the cargo overboard. And those things are interesting stories. They probably will never happen to you, me. They make good books, make good movies, but I'm not sure they happen that often with us. But I wanted to look at a quick story of a guy who threw away something that was extremely valuable to himself. It was Paul. And Paul was not a rich man. He did not have a lot of money, but he did have a really, really good reputation with a certain community. In fact, he could have, the way he writes it in this verse, Philippians 3, 4 through 9, he could have won a bragging contest, okay? Because he says, I'm not a wealthy man, but what I do have is who I am. And he says, I myself have reasons for such confidence. If someone else thinks they have reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. He says, I was circumcised on the 8th day. In other words, he wasn't someone who chose to be a Jew later in life. He was a Jew from the beginning, born and bred of the people of Israel, of one of the best tribes. I come from a good family, the Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. In regard to the law, man, I kept it. I was right in there. I was a Pharisee. As for zeal, man, I was all in. I was persecuting this church, Church of Jesus. As for righteousness based on the law, I was faultless. So he wasn't thinking, I never could keep the law. No, he's saying I was good at it. But he says, whatever were gains to me, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. So I just threw it all in. For whose sake I have lost all things, I consider them as garbage, that I might gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own. It's not based on anything I've done, but that is through faith in Christ, the righteousness that comes from God on the basis of faith. So the point is this. Usually when people come to Christians, a lot of times they think about giving up stuff. They say, I shouldn't be doing that. I shouldn't maybe be using that language, or I shouldn't be doing that over here, and I should be not like that. But here, and you give up bad stuff that you think you're doing. But here, Paul gave up the good stuff. Okay, and so what he's saying is, my connection with God is not based on anything I have done that's good. And so today, if you want to worship God like the Bible teaches, you have to, whatever you think you are that is good, you have to say, I'm a sinner. And it's not on me. It's not because of anything I've done. It's not because I'm smart. It's not because I'm good looking. It's not because I'm holy. It's because of Jesus. And so it begins there. If you want to really worship the Lord, it begins with humility. It's not based on anything you are. You have to give that up just like Paul did. Let it go. It becomes like rubbish. Second ingredient of worship is focus. I was going to talk to you about this, but I forgot what I was talking about. No, just a joke. Focus. Every once in a while, I see people who go to a football game or talk about a football game, and they go to the football game, but they're not really fans. There's a difference. You can go to the football game just to see the halftime show. You can go to the football game, you can wear the clothes, but you're not really a fan. You don't really watch the game. You're not really into it. And I'm not saying that's good or bad for you. It's America. You can like what you want to like. But when it comes to worshiping God, you need to be here and focused when you're here, not thinking about what's going on outside the window. Not thinking about what you're fixing for lunch today or the car that you've got to repair. You got to focus. and it's a lot of work. I remember when I was in seminary once, we had this guy come and speak, and he was from Scotland, okay? He had this really strong accent, but he was brilliant. And I remember that morning, I guess I drunk an extra cup of coffee, and I was focused. And man, I was taking notes. I had like 8 pages of handwritten notes by the time he was finished. He had so much good stuff to say. And after it was over with, I remember leaving and seeing one of my buddies. I said, hey man, how'd you like it? He said, I didn't get nothing out of that. I couldn't even understand it. And I thought, did you really focus on it? How do you get it if you're not really there? We live in a world where a lot of people are like they got spectatoritis. You come and you listen to the group sing and play, you listen to the message or you listen, but when people pray, are you praying with them? There is a big difference between that. I heard of this country boy that he grew up, in the country. He never understood what happened with classical music. He never really got it, but he was at this school and they had these concerts. And so one of his teachers challenged him. He said, why don't you go to the concert every week and listen to it and see if you get something out of it? He said the first time he went, he didn't like it at all, but then he talked to somebody about it and he went the next week and he started going, and after a few weeks, guess what? He started to get it. And he liked it. It took him a while, but he got where he liked it. Isn't worshiping the Lord that important? That we, Psalms 34:3 says this, glorify the Lord with me, let us exalt his name together. That's what we do when we come to church. You don't sit and you review what they're doing on stage in the band and how good the singer is or the guitar player is or the bass player or whatever. You are part of the worship. You are part of it. You are singing. You are going along with it. You're not just going through the motions. You are focused. You are there. Because that's what it means to worship. It means that you show up, and you don't just show up in body, you show up with your heart and with your mind. You're there. Somebody's asked me before, what's the difference between teaching and preaching? I used to teach for Bluefield College, and sometimes when I was teaching, somebody would say, oh, now you're preaching. And I've been preaching before, and somebody said, that was good talk. You're teaching. When I'm doing it like I want to do it, I'm worshiping. That what I'm doing is the same thing that we're all supposed to do. When we come together, we worship. I don't like it when people say, well, we have 15 minutes of worship and then a sermon. Worship is not just the music. It's everything we do here. It's a time where we step away from everything. And so you might ask yourself, well, why do this? Why should we worship God? Why is it that important? I want to spend just a few minutes talking about why worship God, because that's an important thing, okay? First off, worship reminds us of values that the world makes us forget. I was at Sandy's yesterday for breakfast, and they got a new big screen TV on the wall, and it's got Fox News going 24/7. And while I was having a great conversation with some people there at the table, I couldn't help it, but I kept seeing all these disasters, because there's a lot of bad going on in the world right now with Hamas and what's going on with our bases getting attacked by Syria, and what's going on with a volcano somewhere, and what's going on. And there's always this thing at the bottom that says, alert, alert. And so I'm trying to connect with these folks, and all I keep thinking in my mind is alert, alert. And I got to thinking about that. I got to thinking about, when I was a young person, years and years ago, the news came on at 6:30 at night for 30 minutes. Somewhere along the way, that changed to 24/7 news. That's on all the time. And radio, talk radio, that's on all the time. So from the time you wake up to the time you go to bed, you can be plugged in to all the disasters in the world. And it it fills you with anxiety because this is what the world is bringing us, all this bad news, because they can sell stuff with it, and plus it's out there, and so they're going to cover all of it. And so to reconnect with the Lord is important for us. Psalm 100, this is a great psalm. It says this: shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful songs, which is what we're doing this morning. Know that the Lord is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. We are God's. Enter his gates with thanksgiving, his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name. For the Lord is good. This is why we worship. Why? Because the Lord is good. Not because we're good. Because the Lord is good. And his love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations. That should give us a sense of, he's going to be faithful no matter what. No matter what disaster comes next week, no matter if there is an earthquake, a volcano, a war, that his faithfulness will endure. And when we worship, we're reminded of that because the world doesn't teach that. The culture we live in doesn't teach that. Media doesn't teach that. This isn't on talk radio usually. It's not usually on the news 24/7. But we need to know it. That God is, good God, that he is in control. And so that's part of what worship does. Second, worship helps us regain our sense of direction. Now, have you ever gotten lost in the woods? I don't know if any of you have or if you would admit it. I have not been lost, but I've been temporarily going in a new direction. Okay. When that happens, one of the things you could do is climb a tree. Why? You get some altitude and you see where you are. If you ever watch, there's a show about these people who are survivalists, okay? One of them always had barefoot, no shoes on. Never understood why somebody who could be a survivalist couldn't even afford shoes. But anyway, the show on TV was they were survivalists. But a lot of times when they got somewhere and they're trying to figure out how to get out, they would climb up high. Climb a hill, climb a mountain, climb a tree. Because when you get up high, you get some altitude, then you can see where you're going. You see what things are happening. And sometimes in life you need that. You need to be able to take yourself out of the anxious world we live in and get a perspective. Psalms 92, the psalmist says this: before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You ever go out to the mountains? And just sit somewhere and look at it and think, it looked like this before I got here, and it's going to look like this after I leave. Pretty much, the Smoky Mountains. Unless the Lord comes back, I'm just kind of a blip. God is God. God is the creator, and before the mountains were brought forth was God. That's a long time. And he formed the earth, he formed the world from everlasting to everlasting. Thou art God. And that's what we do when we worship. We recalibrate, we rethink about our perspective, who we are in the universe and who God is in the universe. That's what happens in worship. 3, in worship, we feel conviction about the evil in our life. Sermons and messages are not just to feel good stuff about how you can become, richer and healthier and never be sick and all that kind of stuff. It's about being convicted sometimes of things that you're doing wrong. In the Old Testament, they were really really careful about keeping all these traditions. You know, they wanted to do it just right, and they had just the right way to come into church, and just the right clothes to wear, and just the right way to sit, and just the right place to sit. They had all these rules and regulations, and Micah the prophet went to them, and he said this. He said, "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." And so when you come to church, one of the things you should be reminded of is God cares about your morals and your behavior and how you should live. And when you come together to church, sometimes you might feel, oh man, I can't believe he's judging me that way. You know, when I'm writing sermon, I never think of one person I'm trying to preach to. You're glad of that. I'm just thinking about what the Lord's trying to do in my life and thinking about what else he might be speaking through me for. But you know, it's okay if you feel convicted when you come to church. We all do sometimes. And if you're unhappy about some of that, well, get over it. It's part of what happens when we get together. We're different than a bar in town or someplace else where they have a lot of fun and they encourage you and are uplifting and never judge you. Well, that's good to a certain extent, but we also are wanting to become like Christ. We're challenging each other to grow in our faith and grow in who we are. And sometimes you may be convicted about something and it might change your life. You know, I heard a story about a guy at my seminary. The president of the seminary told this story. He said, years ago, we've got this on the second floor in the library. We have Billy Graham room, they call it. It's actually like a museum. And if you go in there, I love to go in there. And you go in there and they have pictures of all the crusades of Billy Graham. They got his Bibles. They got other paraphernalia that Billy Graham used. And it's just really a neat thing to see what happened and how the Lord used that. Well, evidently, somebody stole some of the things in there. And years later, they had an alumni worship service. After that worship service, this person gave it back. Why? They were convicted in worship. Sometimes worship convicts us. Sometimes it may change your heart. It may put a light on something you didn't even think about. 4, worship helps us to rededicate our life and releases God's power, because there are times, it's just not when you come to Christ, but in your life, you need to rededicate your life at different times. There's a new part of your life you need to give over to the Lord, and it releases God's power when you do that. There was, in the Old Testament, Isaiah, he said, I heard the voice of the Lord. He was in a state of worship, and he said, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And he responded, in this worship time, here I am, send me. Have you ever been in worship and felt that call? Maybe it's to do some ministry for God. And in the worship service itself, you were called. And it happened. And that still happens in worship. It might happen today. I was looking in the history of our church, how many people have turned their life over to Christ, and some of them have become missionaries, some have become pastors, some of them have given their lives in other ways of service. What happens in worship is we reconnect with God, and sometimes when you go high up, you get some altitude, you see things, you hear things, you feel things. And when you do that, the presence of God, and this is the thing that I don't know how to explain, but Psalm 22:3 says this, Thou art holy, God is holy, and O thou that inhabits the praises of Israel. And I think that our church is in a way like Israel here, that when we praise the Lord is here. And when we're singing songs, and maybe at the end of the songs, somebody raises their hand and somebody applauds or something like that, the Lord's here. The Lord loves that. and we experience his presence with us. And there's something transformative when we come together and we lift our voices, when we lift our prayers together. It's just not one person praying. When we lift our thoughts and think about the Lord, it lifts us to him. And he's here. Doesn't matter what your age you are. My wife was telling me a story that one evening they had some kind of meeting, and I think the youth and the children were involved. And Jenny, our youth director, said, I want all of you to think about something that you're thankful for and tell somebody. Okay, well, there was a little girl there. I mean, she might be 4 or 5. She's about this tall. Okay. And she kept coming over to Sharon. Sharon was sitting in a chair. And so she was so short, she could just walk right up to Sharon and just go like this and be right at her ear. Okay, and she didn't have any sense of private space. So she would put her hands on Sharon's shoulders and she'd say, I like candy. And then she went and sat down. And then in a few minutes, she'd come over and she'd say, I like my bed. And then she'd go sit down. And then a few minutes later, she'd get up and she'd say something else. She would just, whatever came to her mind, what she liked. And she said, I love my mama. And she kept coming back to her. And one after another, this little 4 or 5-year-old girl was filling her mind with things that she's thankful for at church, in a service. And I thought, that's worship. For a 4 or 5-year-old, that's worship. That's her. And it was filling her mind with those good thoughts. And that's what we need to do when we come to church. Psalms 34:3 says this, glorify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. That's what we're doing. This Thanksgiving, you get together with your family. Church just doesn't happen in a building. I pray that it happens at your home. And spend some time being thankful and worshiping the Lord. And when you do that, his presence is real and is close to you. And I just pray that this Thanksgiving you can really be transformed by the Holy Spirit.